and welcome to the 11th meeting of 2025 of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee. I have received no apologies for today's meeting. Today the committee will continue taking evidence as part of its review, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the committee Ivan McKee, MSP, Minister for Public Finance, and also Angus MacLeod, Head of Public Bodies Support Unit, and Aileen Wright, Deputy Director in Finance, Risk, Control and Assurance. We're grateful for you being here as part of our evidence taking. Thank you. And we move directly to questions. And the first one is from myself, and it's probably one you've been anticipating. But we, of course, have been asked by the Parliament to look at SPCB supported bodies, but they, of course, fit into a wider scenario of public bodies, some of which are funded by the SPB and some of which are funded by the Scottish Government. And our questions today will be mostly in that space about just further understanding the reasons and the way things are organised and why. So, first of all, for myself, I mean, including the Patient Safety Commissioner, which is still to become operational, there are 8 SPCB supported bodies, the majority of which were proposed by the Scottish Government. The latest is the bill proposing a Victims and Witnesses Commissioner, which is at stage 3 on the Criminal Justice Committee, which, well, it passed through the Criminal Justice Committee and it is now, of course, going to go to the parliamentary plenary at stage 3. And I'm just interested if you could explain under what circumstances the government will propose an SPCB supported body rather than a government-sponsored body. How does the government take into account capacity and funding issues for the SPCB in proposing creation of an SPCB-supported body? And what consideration does the Scottish Government give to the overall coherence of the SPC-supported body landscape when proposing new bodies? For example, proposing a commissioner for one group of society, and does this lead to a kind of proliferation and a disjointed landscape? And I appreciate that some of these decisions were made, you know, a decade ago or more. But, so, has there been that kind of strategic approach, or I know there's an ambition to do that going forward, and if you want to touch on that too.
Okay, so yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you this morning. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I suppose worth saying at the outset that clearly the Parliament-supported bodies are in that space for good reasons, and we can kind of talk about that. So, in terms of how much government should influence or be seen to be influencing that, and there's a limit to how appropriate that is, because they're not in the government space for good reasons. But you hinted also, convener, about the fact that this sits within a much broader public body landscape, which I'm also very happy to engage on if the committee wants to go down that route, although I understand it's not, strictly speaking, within your quite tight remit. In terms of the bodies we've got, I mean, those will have grown up over a long number of years in response to requirements that were felt to be necessary at that point in time. And I watched with interest some of your earlier evidence sessions when there's been conversations about should some of those bodies be more closely aligned or amalgamated or whatever. And I think that's a very welcome discussion. But as I say, it's not for government to take a view on how those bodies should be organised. I suppose, and again this has come out in the evidence, there's been 2 types of bodies in that space. There's the bodies that for very good reasons are separate, those that are looking at information or ethics or other regulatory or compliance issues where it's usually important that they are separate from government and are seen to be separate from government. But I suppose there are also then the advocacy groups, if you want to call them that, of there's been a more recent phenomena. I think government is now very much in a place, and you'll see that through the ministerial control framework, that there is a presumption against creating a new public body, and indeed the work that will be taken forward in the public service reform strategy will be publishing next month will set in train some work to review how many bodies we have and whether we need as many as we do have. So that is, I would say, very much the direction of travel, rather than creating new bodies in response to every need. And the MCF, the Ministerial Control Framework, lays out a process whereby we go through various gates to check whether a new body was necessary. But you're right to say a number of these bodies that are in, through the process were set in train a while ago.
Thank you. And I know colleagues will ask more in some of those areas later this morning. I mean, I think one of the issues that's really been on our minds is that, for example, last week we heard from 3 public bodies that are different types of arm's length government bodies, but are still very much seen, both in Parliament and the public domain, as very independent of government. For example, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and it stated that it does not think that being an SPC body would mean it would function any more independently than it does now, being funded by the Scottish Government. So, in your consideration for a new public body, how do you determine, or how does the Scottish Government determine, rather, the level of independence the body requires from government? And does your consideration of the creation of new public bodies fit with the Scottish Government's wider public service reform programme? Well, I mean, sorry, you've just answered that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I think there's clearly many different types of categorisation of public bodies. Now, are there too many different types? That might be something that's worth looking at. I mean, again, this isn't something that we sat down and designed. It's grown up over a period of time, and there are some bodies that are effectively part of government. There are other, but have as an executive agency, have a slightly different setup, but they're effectively part of government for all intents and purposes. There are other that operate independently, but as you say, are funded and guided by government, typically in the delivery space, where we want them to perform a function that's delivering services or economic impact or whatever it happens to be. But yeah, there are then very much bodies that, for very good reasons, you would want them to have that independence to be able to comment on what government's doing, and to provide information. In the example of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, where it absolutely needs to be seen to be their own work and not influenced by government. So having that clear distinction regarding their independence is very important. Whether some of those could or should be under the guise of Parliament rather than government, I think that, frankly, is an area that I'd be very open to discussing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're glad to hear there's an openness about that.
Absolutely.
As we form our conclusions about how collectively we move forward, that openness for rethinking some of this methodology, I think, would be useful for all of us. Murdo Fraser, I'm going to turn to you now, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister and officials. One issue that the committee has been considering is the rationale behind this drive to create new commissioners. And you'll be aware there are 3 proposals in train. There might be others in the ether, people wanting to create new commissioners around disability, older people, and what's the third one? Future generations. Thank you, Convener. That's the third one. And one of the things we've been trying to understand is, what's the driver for this? Why are people proposing commissioners? Because, we're not exactly an under-governed country. 129 MSPs, 57 MPs, 20-something government ministers, 130-something government bodies. So why are people wanting more commissioners? And one of the things that's been said to us is because people feel frustrated that there's a failure in terms of delivery, in terms of what government's trying to do, and therefore they see a commissioner as a way to try and force the pace of change. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that, if you recognise that concern.
I wouldn't want to speak for members or others that feel they need to bring forward those proposals. I know that you've had a number of members that are seeking to bring forward new commissioners in front of the committee. What I would say is, in terms of system design, to generically, if you keep adding more layers and more bodies and more, you don't make the process simpler, you make it more complex. And then I would suggest there's a relationship between the complexity of the system and its ability to deliver. So I think by doing that, you absolutely run the risk of making the problem worse, not better, because you've just got more people in the space that you need to be engaged with and are in the process, which makes the delivery process more complex. So as a general rule, simplicity is probably the best design principle when it comes to looking for effective and efficient delivery. Now, within that, clearly, you need checks and balances, and that's an important part of the landscape. But I would say that it's important to recognise that's a principle. I suspect you're possibly right that people feel that by having a commissioner, it elevates the status of the group that they're advocating for. It gives them more people to talk to, more opportunity to get what the issues that they want raised in front of government or in front of the Parliament. That may well be the case, but as I say, in terms of how effective that is, in terms of those specific groups or the system as a whole, you're better looking at why the system isn't performing. I mean, I would argue that delivery can always be better, and of course there are challenges out there. Some of that will be fiscal challenges, some of it will be due to other impacts on society and the economy. But just because everything isn't as good as people should expect it to be, that doesn't necessarily mean that a new commissioner is the answer.
Thank you for that. What I'm interested in is how you, as a minister or as part of government, how you view the commissioners. What is the value of a commissioner, an independent SPCB supported commissioner, as opposed to MSPs, MPs, others?
Oh, you're right, and I mean, in terms of the advocacy role, if we're looking at that part of it, and that's something that's come out in your evidence, is that, I can't remember who it was that said it, but MSPs have got a very important advocacy role because we got a lot of people come to our door and we then make the case for them and the situation that they find themselves in and how that can be addressed. I suppose it's important to parse that out into the regulatory, if we want to call it that, bodies, where, not that we would, but if we come in and said we didn't think that the Information Commissioner or the Ethics Commissioner or whatever should be doing what they're doing. Clearly,
I think to be fair, we recognise there's a difference.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think those are very clear. I know you've had some discussion about whether there should be fewer of them and more the scope for amalgamation and so on. But frankly, as I say, that's something that government wouldn't want to get involved in that discussion for obvious good reasons. But I think abstractly you would say that they do a very important job because as part of the democratic process and the checks and balances that are within that, it's essential that those roles, those regulatory roles, are carried out. In terms of the advocacy groups, I think it will depend very much on the individual situation because every context is going to be different. So a different group advocating for a different group within society, they'll be interacting with different agencies, different parts of government, they'll face different challenges. So I suppose that the value that they'll bring to that will vary depending on what it is, and that'll be very much at the portfolio level, depending on who the relevant minister is that's responsible for that.
As a minister, what is more likely to keep you awake at night? Is it a report from a commissioner or a report from, say, a parliamentary committee? Assuming it's critical.
Questions in the chamber from yourself, Mr. Fraser.
Well, of course.
But leaving that aside.
What I'm trying to you see, the point I'm trying to get to is this: what is the added value of a commissioner, as opposed to, say, we have cross-party parliamentary committees who produce reports.
Yeah.
So you have a critical report from a commissioner and a critical report from a parliamentary committee. You as a minister, which of these has more weight?
I mean, others may have a different perspective on it based on their experience of that. I would say that they've both got the ability to gain traction in the media, which at the end of the day is where that pressure would be felt. So if either of those routes was generating commentary that was commenting on government's performance or what we've done or anything else, then I think they've both got the ability to generate that pressure.
That's a very diplomatic answer.
I suppose the question is, do you get more, as a commissioner, got a route to be able to create more pressure than a committee has? I'm not sure. That there may well be examples where that's happened, and others, I say, because their portfolio experience might have a different experience. But I think in either case, they're able to bring pressure to bear.
Yeah. So it's more about the outside noise that could be generated.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if the committee produces a report that's critical for good reason of things that government has done, and that's deemed to be in the public interest, I'm sure media will pick that up.
I'm looking at the convener of the Public Audit Committee, who's sitting two down, who
absolutely
regularly produces critical reports for the government, which I'm sure the government ministers wake up to, pay attention to. Yeah. Okay, right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Murdo. Lorna, you want to come in?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to see us this morning, Minister. So this committee has been tasked with looking at the SPCB supported bodies, but of course the work that they do sits within the wider landscape of both government scrutiny and the public body landscape. So given that this committee is going to need to make some recommendations, some of those might be quite wide-reaching or ambitious, maybe suggesting primary legislation. I wanted to kind of feel out what you thought was the art of the possible in terms of where we go next. So I've got a few questions, if the convener will indulge me. To pick up on that independence point that the convener raised earlier, both government-supported public bodies and the SPC-supported bodies both emphasised the importance of independence and testified to their own independence. So from my point of view, there isn't a difference in terms of how they feel about that independence, or indeed how practicable that is. So one of the things that this committee could recommend, although I'm not saying that we would, is to reclassify SPCB supported bodies out of that landscape. So if our task is just to look at that landscape, punting some of those out into the wider public body space would be a solution, but it isn't necessarily the right solution. But I just wanted to kind of test those points with you on independence and on that reclassification point, whether that would make any fundamental difference to the wider landscape. I'm
going to say that, I mean, it's interesting you've had the evidence back from those bodies that they don't see that that's an important constraint or an important difference. And I think that's very valuable evidence from them. And as I said, there are examples like the Fiscal Commission where their independence is clearly important. I suppose I'm a wee bit wary because I wouldn't want... I think government needs to still be able to keep its distance from some of these bodies for good reason, because of the important role that they play. I think if that was a recommendation, the committee absolutely would consider that. I think that if we were looking at a scenario where, and again this has come up in your discussions, there was a reorganisation of some of those bodies, again I think that would be something that probably would be better handled in the Parliament space than in the government space, again for good reasons. But I think we'd be open to considering that if that's where the committee felt the best direction was. I don't know if officials want to comment on anything specific there.
Can I just come in with an additional point there, because I do think the area that Lorna Slater's raised and Myrtle Fraser touched on it a bit as well is important, because I totally agree with you, Minister, that there are some of these FPC bodies, for example, like the Information Commissioner, where it's, there's a very clear rationale why it's funded by the SPCB, but there are a number of others, when compared with some public bodies with the Scottish Government, like, for example, the Fiscal Commission that we spoke to last week, just citing the example that I gave, where their independence is very, very, very clear, even though they're funded by government. And I guess the point is that from our perspective, and we don't know what our recommendations are going to be, but if there was any suggestion from our recommendations towards amalgamation or reorganisation, then that is going to have to be a joint exercise with government and Parliament, because of the the situation that we have at the moment, where there's not really a consistency as to why bodies are funded by either the Parliament or government. Is that
no,
a
no,
fair
I absolutely
point?
understand that, and I suppose I was just guarding against a scenario where you just gave them all to government and expect the government to reorganise it. That would be, but as a joint work on a cross-party basis, then I think we're absolutely very happy to engage in that space.
Thank you.
Happy for me to carry on, right. So one of my hypotheses as to why we have seen a proliferation in commissioners, well, I think there's two. One is that it's reactionary to problems that we've had in the public sector, specific scandals around patients or victims of crime, for example, but also that it's more glamorous politically to create a new thing. Look, I've made a new thing, I've solved your problem, rather than tweaking or adjusting existing powers or resources. Part of that is, I think that means that we have been reactionary and that we put in place commissioners to try and sort of bandage up problems rather than looking at how problems may be prevented. One of those things that we've heard from the Ombudsman, for example, is that they have been asking for a while for investigative powers, which would allow them to potentially identify problems in the public sector before they became scandals, thereby not requiring all these kind of commissioners to come by after the fact and go, oh God, we've got to react to something negative that's happened. What is your view on the sort of role of public bodies in that prevention and investigative space? Do you feel that do you have an appetite for looking at that in terms of moving our public sector to a more preventative space, which would require additional powers to groups like the Ombudsman and the Human Rights Commission and so on? Yeah,
I mean, in broad terms, absolutely. I agree that you're better to catch the problems earlier rather than later, and as I said earlier, getting the right design of the system and the right delivery mechanisms is hugely important part of. I mean, that's where you resolve the problems. You don't resolve the problems by coming along and inspecting out the faults at the end of the process. You design the process so you're not generating the faults at an earlier stage. That's absolutely true. So, in principle, very supportive of anything that helps to prevent those problems happening. Clearly, if we're going to talk about expanding powers, then of course that's going to be depending on what it is we're talking about. There'll be other aspects of that need to be considered in the round. But in principle, as an approach, then I've absolutely no problem with something that does that and prevents problems arising early in the process. And in terms of your comment about shiny new things, yes, I mean, we need to guard against the tendency to embrace shiny new things. The problem then, of course, is you get criticised for what are you actually doing, which puts you back in the shiny new things space, potentially. But yeah, as ministers and government, we've got a responsibility to guard against that. One of the challenges that's been presented to us by the various public bodies that we've spoken to, both SPCB supported ones and other ones, is how they make their work relevant and feed into both Parliament and government. And some of my colleagues will come into some of the mechanisms around that. But I guess at the higher level, how do you see the paradox between bodies being independent, so they get to decide what they're going to investigate, they decide what they're looking into, but maybe that isn't what is on the government's agenda, so there's no legislation coming through on that, there's no focus on that. So we have commissioners putting out papers, excellent papers, they've done lots of work on, but they go nowhere. They aren't read by any particular parliamentary committee, they aren't picked up by the government in any way. So there's a lot of resource going into excellent work that isn't fed in because it either isn't timely, isn't related to legislation, isn't in line with government priorities or concerns, and isn't being picked up by parliamentary committees and so on. So do you have any thoughts on the relevance of the work being done by both SPCB supported bodies and commissioners? What gets through to you? What lands on your desk? What do you think, sort of related to what Murdo Fraser was asking, in terms of ministers I know are bombarded by so much information from MSPs, from all the various commissioners, public bodies, third sector organisations. How can we make sure that our SPCB supported bodies and other public bodies do work that actually lands on ministers' desks and gets actioned? I suppose to some extent, well, I mean, again, separating out the regulatory bodies, because they'll obviously go do their thing, and it's absolutely, we wouldn't want, and not but anybody wants to tell them what to go and investigate, they'll do their thing. But in terms of the advocacy commissioners, if you can call it that, those bodies, I would kind of flip that. I'm not sure that we'd want to be in a place where government was telling the landscape what to go and look at, right? Because that's a guaranteed mechanism for missing things, right? Because people are out there looking at stuff and uncovering things and pointing at things that they think that we should be looking at. So I think that that's a very valid work, and the fact that not all of that leads to anything isn't necessarily a problem, frankly, because there'll be, if that's what we see as that job in the advocacy space, then it's important that they're doing that. And yeah, I mean, there will be examples where government's laying out a challenge or has got issues it wants to deal with. And I mean, talk about the work we're taking forward on public service reform. I mean, very welcome for groups, individuals, committees to be part of that process or input to that. But I suppose it's for those groups, bodies, whatever, to make their own decisions on what they want to go look at, with a view to input into government's thinking, or indeed helping to direct where government should go look. I suppose in the advocacy space, as you mentioned, there's lots of different groups that are doing that, right? So the Commissioner can do stuff on that, committees will do stuff in that space. The third sector organisations and NGOs will do stuff in that space as well. Campaigning groups and lots of others. So they're not alone in raising the concerns of the group that they're advocating for.
And just to sort of hit on the point that Murdo Fraser touched on, is a commissioner any more effective in those spaces than MSPs or third sector organisations? Is there some big difference between, oh, well, the commissioner said it, we must do it, and, oh, I'm hearing this from third sectors and MSPs? Does the commissioner actually have a material impact in your experience over those other?
I'll give you my experience. I've got 3 ex-ministers in the committee who also have their own experiences of this from different portfolios. But I think it's one voice among several. And it will depend very much on the context, the portfolio, the issue, what it happens to be, whether the Commissioner may come up with something that's very important and that we need to, and is very significant, but equally that could be coming from a range of other directions as well.
Two more questions, Convener. I'll try and be quick with them. One of the things that this committee may recommend, something we've talked about, we have not made any decisions yet, is recommendations that require primary legislation, something like a consolidation bill that maybe did give those powers to the Ombudsman of investigation that they've been asking for, that empower the Human Rights Commission in a way that they are not currently empowered to cover some of these advocacy things, and maybe has some consolidation functions of existing SPCB supported bodies with proposed ones. What is the Scottish Government's appetite for that kind of primary legislation?
Well, I think to defer to my colleague, the Minister for Parliamentary Business, who'll tell us there's absolutely no space in the calendar, obviously, in this session. But clearly, I think you're talking at the next session anyway, given the timescales. So conceptually, I think government, anything that's going to make the landscape more effective and more efficient, both within the remit that you've got around Parliament-supported businesses, but also in the much larger, wider public body landscape, we're absolutely willing to engage on that.
So just for my final point, to clarify that, so that is roughly in line with Scottish Government intentions to do that kind of revision and potential consolidation as part of the review of public sector landscape. So we wouldn't be at odds with government intention or direction there?
No. Well, in terms of the direction of travel is to look for opportunities to simplify the landscape. Now, just to be clear on that we don't see structural changes as the first route of call. There's a lot of things we do before we get to structural change, which is cooperation between public bodies, shared services, shared resources, removing duplication, working closely in clusters, etc. If that then leads us to a place, and I'm talking about the broader public body landscape, to a place where the structural reorganisation is the right answer, then we'd move into that space. Absolutely. and then where there is legislation required to do that, then we take that forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
But we
Thank
don't
you,
start
Convener.
with that. We get to that once we've exhausted everything else.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Yeah, we appreciate the public service reform programme is going to take some time and is a large piece of evaluation and then consideration and then implementation. And we just want to, as part of our work, if there are things we can constructively recommend that dovetail into that, and whether that will require primary legislation or not is still to be determined. A Consolidation Act is not something that the Scottish Parliament has, I think, done at all, but it does happen in the UK Parliament, and it might be something interesting to consider.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. Richard Leonard.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms Wright, Mr MacLeod, Minister. Can I start with that final area that you were talking about, which is the public sector reform agenda, but also place it in the context of the ministerial control framework. Have you undertaken a mapping exercise to look at where different functions sit amongst the 131 public bodies that are covered by the Scottish Government?
When you say different functions, you mean different...
well, to see whether there's duplication or overlap.
No, that's an ongoing process. So if you look at what we're doing on shared services, which is IT systems that support HR, finance and so on, we've now got, I think, 32 public bodies on the shared service system, and I've got calls every week with the director that leads on that, every month with the director that leads on that to look at other bodies that they're working to bring on board. So that process is happening. We've got I meet with different cluster groups within clusters of public bodies who in different portfolios are working together to take out duplication and look for opportunities to share services, and we're going to accelerate that work through the public service reform strategy, and there's quite a bit of other activity happening there. So we don't have a big chart with everything on it because I think it's far too complicated for that, but what we do have is within strands within that, as I say, be it the IT shared services, be it on digital, where we're moving towards virtual digital budgets and tracking of digital resource across those, so as we understand how much digital resource there is out there, contractor and employed, and what they're working on, what projects they're on, how we prioritise all of that. So there's a lot to tackle there, but we're absolutely on the journey of increasingly having more information and more impact on how those resources are more effectively shared.
Okay, and as the convener of the Public Audit Committee, I'm obviously interested in that aspect of reform. Yeah. But my question in the context of being a member of this committee is asking you whether you have carried out any kind of assessment of whether there is an overlap or duplication around the purposes of these different public bodies. So it's not just about whether you can share IT systems and HR systems. It's also about whether you've got two bodies which are doing in part coincidental work or have got a coincidental purpose.
Well, the answer is yes, in the sense of we are always looking for opportunities or looking for examples where that is indeed the case, and asking the question, this is a question I always ask when I meet with Cabinet Secretaries, to what extent are you looking at the bodies you've got in your portfolio? Is there scope for consolidation here? Are there overlaps? And also interesting overlaps between different portfolios. One of the things, we tend to look at this in, as I say, in a portfolio space, but if you look at it and ask the question, what is the specific expertise that this body brings to the public sector landscape? So it might be a body that's got expertise in making payments, it might be a body that's got expertise in gathering revenue, it might be a body that's got expertise in a specific functional aspect in terms of standard setting or whatever it is that cuts across portfolios. We're absolutely in the business of looking for those opportunities as well, where we can capitalise on expertise that's out there that public bodies can then offer as a service to other public bodies, which means other public bodies don't need to do that, or they can bring that, we can consolidate there. There's a job for government there. There's very much a job for public sector leaders there, because nobody knows everything about all 130 odd public bodies and what they're all doing. Different people know different bits in that. So there's absolutely a role for public sector leaders as well to engage, and many of them are very proactive in that space.
Yeah, and we had an example last week where His Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary was talking to us about some collaborative work that he was doing with Audit Scotland, looking at the best value audit of Police Scotland, for example. So there are good examples where there can be those kind of synergies too. But let me move from the existing landscape to looking at the process. I mean, you've got, as I read it, a 13-step process in the ministerial control framework to assess whether or not a new body is warranted. And the kind of mantra underpinning that is there should only be the creation of a new body as a last resort. Yeah. What does that mean in practice?
Well, I think you've probably answered the question. If you can get through the 13 steps, then you've got to say that if they survived that ordeal, then there's probably a good case for them to be considered. But the presumption is that we shouldn't have to do that. The framework is an attempt, a process that helps to codify what you need to go through to be able to make the case for why you would need a new public body. And I think that is an effective approach, but I'm very willing to hear other suggestions as to how we can make that process even more robust.
Okay. I mean, the framework was introduced exactly 2 years ago, May 2023. So in those 2 years, how many new public bodies have been created?
To my knowledge, we've got one that's come through that, which is the National Social Work Agency, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that for various reasons haven't been set up. Now, some of those you could say that they wouldn't have been set up anyway for other reasons, but there's 5 that didn't go through that process.
So they've been rejected?
As I say, they've been rejected for a variety of reasons, not necessarily because of that process, but they didn't even get through that. Process.
Which step in the 13 did they get to?
I would need to go and come back to and write to the committee on the specifics on that.
Yeah, okay, that would be helpful. Can I just one of the steps? I think it's step 11, Minister, is the occasion where there may be a requirement for ministerial written authority. In other words, presumably the assessment from the civil service is that the proposal doesn't represent efficiency, effectiveness or economy. But nonetheless, there's a political imperative to create this new body or to create this new position. Are there any examples where that has been required?
No.
No, there are not.
No, because they would have had to come through the process, and it's the only one has to date. So.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions I've got in that area for now. Convener.
Thank you very much, Richard Leonard. And now turn to Ash Regan.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. If you've been watching any of the committee's deliberations, you'll know that we're very interested in the idea of scrutiny and accountability of public bodies. Obviously, there's different types of public bodies. Some are obviously accountable to the Parliament, some to government. But we're interested in what measures the Scottish Government has in place that would require and measure, I guess, effective governance in these bodies, and also, scrutinise their performance as well, but across all public bodies.
Yeah. So I think this takes you into an interesting space, because rightly ministers will be held account, and I'm talking about delivery bodies here in the public sector landscape, so but it doesn't reflect on the SPCB supported bodies to the same extent. Ministers will be held accountable, as we are every day in Parliament and elsewhere, for the performance of delivery bodies, but depending on the nature of the body, there can be an arm's length relationship there. So we don't obviously tell those public bodies exactly what they should do on a daily basis. We appoint the board that then appoints the executives. We give them the budget. We have the framework document that we've talked about in evidence that explains that relationship, and then they get on with it, right? There is, and to be fair, that's the correct way of doing it, because you wouldn't want ministers involved in every single last detail for very good reasons of every single public body. So managing that is always it's a challenge, but it's important to recognise that there's various checks and balances in the system around how the bodies operate vis-à-vis ministers. Ministers aren't the accountable officers, that in terms of the finances, etc. That sits with the chief executives of those bodies by and large. There are the sponsor teams within government that have then got the responsibility for engaging with the public bodies, and they've got a very important role to play in terms of that scrutiny in terms of compliance. There are clearly potentially performance issues that will get raised, and those will be the subject of discussion obviously within government on a very regular basis, and there are several areas where obviously that is quite high profile, so that would be talked about on a very, very regular basis within government, but as I say, the operational aspect of that will still be carried out by and large by the delivery body. And then of course you've got Scotland Auditor General and others that would be engaged in the very essential work that they do to keep track of how those bodies are performing at various levels. And then of course there's the parliamentary scrutiny where ministers will be held to account in the chamber and indeed in committee. And of course committees have got the opportunity to bring in chief execs and chairs as well from public bodies. So I think there's various levels where that operates. But as I say, it's important to understand the distinction between the operation of those delivery bodies on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. So in your view, is the level of accountability to the Scottish Government consistent across all public bodies?
The level of accountability of the public bodies to the Scottish Government, or the level of accountability of the Scottish Government to Parliament?
The Scottish Government, yeah.
To the Scottish Government. Yeah. It varies, and it'll depend on the nature of the body. Some executive agencies are very close to government, others are non-ministerial offices and so on are further away for good reasons, and then it will depend on different portfolios because of the nature of what they're trying to do and the.
So from what you've seen, do you think there's gaps here in accountability?
I would say, given that ministers are held accountable for it to Parliament and to the public and were elected to do that, I would say that it's important that ministers are able to influence that to a large extent. So I think if we end up in a place where performance isn't where it should be, it's important that ministers are able to engage proactively with those public bodies to make sure that we can resolve situations.
Okay. So on the Scottish Government website, it says that there are 131 devolved public bodies in Scotland and that they're subdivided into 9 categories by type of body. So can you explain to the committee how the Scottish Government decides which category a public body is placed in, and what level of importance does the government put on ensuring whether that classification is correct, and perhaps does it ever get reviewed?
Well, a lot of it will grown up historically, so a lot of it is being put in place over a long period of time, and some of those bodies obviously predate the creation of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament by some way. So I'll say a lot of that is historical. It will be taken on an individual by individual case depending on the nature of what the body's been asked to do and where it should sit. There are examples of bodies that have been moved from one classification to another over time. Okay. There are, and in answer to the last part of your question, should this be reviewed? I think it will be reviewed on an ad hoc basis, on an ongoing basis in an ad hoc sense. But is there a need for a more structured review of that? I wouldn't be opposed to doing that, just to ensure that we've got everything in the right place, to be honest.
So your view is there would be scope for bodies to move between categories?
Absolutely, absolutely. Depending on, and depending on the category they're in, it can have implications for their ability to operate in terms of their ONS classification, for example, which can affect their funding or their revenue generation opportunities or other aspects. So that can change over time, obviously. But I think in general, the question is there scope for a review to ensure that everything's in the right place? Then I think we'd be open to that.
So the committee's heard that most of these public bodies produce an annual report or other similar types of reports. From your view, in terms of this, how the government would view this, are these annual reports useful? Do they contain the right types of information from the government's perspective?
Yeah, I think they do. And again, every case is going to be different. That'll come back to ministers, and ministers by and large will be very engaged with the public body anyway, so we'll have a good understanding of what it is they're working on. So it gives a sense check for ministers and officials that the public body is pointing in the right direction and they've got the right priorities and the right focus. And then obviously it's a matter of public record, which allows the wider ecosystem to be able to understand and see what the body's doing.
Okay, in fact, just finally, the committee has taken quite a bit of evidence that would seem to suggest that the Parliament capacity is an issue when it comes to scrutiny and accountability to Parliament bodies, but perhaps to other ones as well. Does the government have a view on that?
Well, obviously, Parliament, in the way of committees, has got a hugely important role here. And it's not up to government to decide how many committees there should be or what their workload should be, obviously. And committees have got the scope to be able to call in, if you're talking about the broader range of public bodies, the ability to call those in and question them based on what it is that the inquiry that the committee is taking forward.
I suppose what I'm asking you, forgive me, is does the government think there's an issue with capacity in the Parliament?
Well, that's up to if Parliament wants to make a case for that, then. But I don't know in terms of capacity, what in terms of number of MSPs, number of committees, the amount of time that committees spend on specific things. I mean, capacity in what sense?
For scrutiny.
Well, if the argument is you think you need more committees or more committees sitting for longer hours, then clearly that's up to Parliament. That's not an issue for government.
You wouldn't be prepared to take a view on that?
No, it's up to Parliament to figure out what it needs to do.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And I appreciate that one of the other committees in Parliament is looking at the issue of scrutiny and what committees do. And it's been interesting, some of the issues that have come up here that may relate to that work. So I appreciate your answers on those points. And thanks, Ash, for your questions. I'm now going to go back to Richard Leonard on questions of auditing.
Yeah, this is my chosen specialist subject. Can I? Last week we had three commissions in front of us, or the HM Inspectorate and the Scottish Fiscal Commission and the Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland. And what we learned from their evidence was that two of them are separately audited by Audit Scotland and/or by their appointed auditors. But one is part of the audit conducted into the Scottish Government's consolidated accounts. Could you explain, or could your officials explain, how the determination is whether a body is subsumed into the overall audit of the Scottish Government or is separately audited as a separate body?
It may depend on the classification, but I shall defer to officials who may have the answer.
I think it's exactly that. So it's the nature of the body, whether it's indeed a body. So what we have sometimes are office holders or tribunals or what we call non-executive NDPBs, which are advisory or tribunal bodies, which are within government. They're made up perhaps of an office holder who has very specific responsibilities, such as an inspector. Or they're made up of perhaps a panel of members who come together for a specific purpose, and they don't have a body that supports them. They just have the expenses of running that process. So those expenses and the kind of admin of that is done within the SG, and therefore that is part of SG expenditure that is then, as you say, part of the wider SG audit and in the SG consolidated accounts.
Okay, so but you think that's quite a robust system? You don't think anyone is in the wrong category for auditing purposes?
I guess that's a separate question. The auditing requirements come from the classification and what the body is, or whether it is a body. I mean, once you get into the territory of having a separate independent body with its own classification that has to produce accounts because it's got legislation, then you are absolutely in that separate Audit Scotland Auditor General space.
So, as far as the kind of the oversight of that by the Scottish Government, by the sponsor team, or whichever part of the Scottish Government is relevant, what's the difference of oversight between, say, the oversight of the audit of HM Inspectorate versus the oversight of the audit of the Scottish Fiscal Commission or the Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland?
I suppose, if I'm wrong, but I suppose it comes down to if you've got an organisation that employs staff and has got a building and has got a budget and is spending money and it's got accounts, then you clearly audit that as that entity. If it's an inspector or a group that doesn't have that back office support and that's provided by government and they're not running their own budget line per se, then that would be consolidated within the government accounts. So in both cases, well, clearly the process is different, but I think that would be the determining factor into which category that would sit in. But the scrutiny, the level of scrutiny through whatever route should be, as effective.
Okay. I mean, we've had the incident recently. I know Mr MacLeod is familiar with the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, which is quite a small organisation, clearly at arm's length from government, but which has been the subject of Section 22 reports by Audit Scotland because of issues around governance and expenditure and so on. So I'm just wondering if there was an internal part of the Scottish Government that had similar issues, how they would be addressed.
Well, if it's within government, then you've got the accountable officers who have responsibility for that. There'd be a director that'd be looking at through their budget lines. There'd be a director general as the accountable officer. There's the principal accounting officer, who's the permanent secretary. So that would be dealt with in the same way as any other expenditure within the civil service.
Okay. Okay, fine. One of the themes that was presented to us, especially by the corporate body supported commissioners, was a feeling that they felt that the level of audit that they were subject to was overburdensome and was disproportionate for the size of the organisation and the functions it performed. Is that something that, and again I'm looking not just at you, Minister, but at your team, is that something which you've picked up from any of those supported bodies which the Scottish Government is responsible for?
Not specifically in regard to audit, but more generally with regard to reporting requirements and information gathering and so on. And we're working through the PSR strategy with public bodies for opportunities where we can make those requirements more proportionate and more effective, so that we're gathering the right information or checking the right things that's going to make a difference, and not just collecting information for the sake of it, or going through processes that add cost but don't add any value. So if there are examples where audit falls into that category, then I'd be willing to look at that. But of course, bearing in mind that audit has its own regime for very good reasons in terms of legally what you need to go through and what you need to check and why you need to check it and how you need to do it. So, but I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I guess maybe a wee distinction between the external audit, which absolutely is the purview of the Auditor General and Audit Scotland and the independent auditors. And if that, if they're producing accounts and they're in that audit regime, then that is absolutely separate from ministers or the Scottish Government. If they were maybe talking about internal audit, then that's conversations we'd expect the accountable officer who's responsible for ensuring that they have the right kind of internal audit for the nature of the body. I'd expect that to be a conversation with their internal audit provider, whether that's internal or whether that's a service provider, so that they do have something that's proportionate to the nature of their organisation and the risks that they have.
But again, just for completeness, my final question really is the proportionality of the audit process something which you are looking at as part of your assessment of public service reform and whether the landscape is fit for purpose?
I say we're looking more generally at information gathering requirements and the onerousness, if that's a word, of those requirements on public bodies. And if where appropriate, if audit falls within that, then absolutely would consider that. But I would say we're very open to any specific examples you want to point in our direction where we can include them in the scope of that work.
Okay, as I say, the theme that's come through is a view that perhaps just as HM Inspectorate is part of a more collective audit, part of the Scottish Government's audit, maybe some of the bodies that we're looking at could be the subject of the Parliament's audit, internal audit, rather than being separately audited. I'm sorry, I'm not advocating that. Yeah. I'm just saying that's reflecting back on part of the evidence that we've taken as a committee.
Well, again, if they're Parliament bodies, then it wouldn't be for government to be involved in that process anyway. So,
sure. Okay. Thank you. Gawain.
Thanks, Richard. Ash, you want to come back in?
Thank you. Yes, this is linked to scrutiny. I'm interested in the government's view on. This is a body that's the Parliament is supporting, so it's not a government one, and the committee has taken evidence that this commission, so it's the Scottish Human Rights Commission, is not fulfilling its remit in terms of the set-up of its enabling legislation. Now, that's quite an important committee in Scotland, so I'm wondering if the Scottish Government in the first instance is aware of that failure, and is the Government concerned about it?
So this is evidence you took from...
A number of different witnesses.
Right, okay. Well, clearly if somebody's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, we'd be concerned about it. But it's not something I personally am aware of. Whether government more widely is aware of that, I don't know, but I don't know if you've got any...
Yeah, it would be in a different portfolio. It would come to our way.
It's not something ever that the Scottish Government would be monitoring at all in terms of performance of other bodies, no?
Well, within the relevant portfolio, and that would be what communities, equality, whatever, they would be obviously have a very close relationship, which would allow them to take a view on, not with the body, but also with relevant stakeholders, where they would be able to take a view on that. But it's not something I'm personally aware of. Okay. But we can check in it. If there's anything specific, we can write back.
That would be helpful.
Check in with the relevant portfolio on that.
Thanks, Ash Regan. It was some points that Ash raised in the evidence session with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and I think has also been raised in other committees.
It was also raised by official as well that there were issues, so that was a confirmation.
Okay. And I think if I don't know if you want, if Ash Regan wants to write to you with more details and provide the Minister with more information, I think that would be a good way forward.
Absolutely.
If all is content.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Do members have any other questions? Lorna Slater, you want to come?
Thank you. Since we seem to be doing all right for time, if that's all right, convener. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to go a little bit further into the comment that you made, Minister, about the commissioners are one voice amongst many. I'm interested in this point about how we do have effective advocacy. In terms of whether that is expanding the role of the Human Rights Commission to take on these advocacy roles, so we don't need a separate Victims Commissioner, Young People's Commissioner, Old People's Commissioner, and so on. One of the other proposals that's come across our desks is whether there should be a minister for these things, whether it should be included in ministerial portfolios, as in one of the ministerial portfolios is the Minister for Older People or the Minister for Disabled People and so on. I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that. And there's two aspects to this. One is whether you think that would be an effective way of advocating that then allows the entire Parliament to hold the responsible person to account. And secondly, one of the criticisms that we've had levelled to us through the evidence is when the Scottish Government creates a new commissioner, the accusation is that is the Scottish Government dodging responsibility, because then the government is able to say, oh, well, the commissioner's doing that, it's not us. So the idea, this idea of having a minister for this advocacy, would that bring that back on board and solve that problem? Are there any disadvantages to this?
Well, the job titles would be exceedingly long, which is probably not an advantage. I think many of them are far too long already as it is, because we do just that. We try to put things into job titles to cover a whole range of topics. I mean, I'm the Minister for Public Finance and for Public Service Reform and for pensions and for accounting and bankruptcy and for planning and for a whole bunch of stuff I've forgotten that officials will remind me when I leave here, that I engage with on a daily basis. So if you look on the government website and you click on the Minister's name, you'll get a whole page of things that they're responsible for. So I think that is clear and transparent, and I think putting all of that into job titles would get a bit, frankly, ridiculous quite quickly. So I just need to be a wee bit careful about that.
And on the point of how would you respond to the sort of accusation that by creating a commission, the government is actually dodging responsibility because that's now them to be accountable rather than the ministers? No,
I don't think so. I don't think anybody would think that. Maybe they do, but they shouldn't, because as I said earlier, it's another voice that is then in the business of drawing attention to the issues that need to be addressed. So I wouldn't think that. If anybody does think that, then it's not, I don't think, a very effective strategy.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Minister, just a few final questions from myself. You talked about shared services earlier, and this has obviously been an area that has been of a particular focus for yourself, both in your previous ministerial brief and since you assumed your current one. And it's very interesting more widely, but in relation to this committee, it's relevant too. I mean, we've heard from SPC supported bodies that the co-location of services is working well where it happens. For example, in Bridgeside House, which just for clarity is in my constituency, and the hub and spoke model proposed by the Biometrics Commissioner, which I don't know if you heard that evidence, but it was it was quite interesting. He talked about how certain back office functions centralised with the potential to group alike commissioners together could be helpful. I mean, how does the government approach shared services between public bodies? I know you spoke earlier about how you're trying to improve that. And in that space, and your determination to deliver a more efficient approach to public sector property management, for example, in a single Scottish estate programme, it'd be good to hear an update on that programme, but also any reflections on, for example, the co-location of a number of the SPC-supported bodies in Bridgeside House is working well, but could that happen in another building that is part of the Scottish Government estate, for example, to save further public money?
Yes to all of that. The way we're approaching the lease, the estate strategy is really on two levels. There's more longer-term work going on in the cities, in terms of Glasgow and Edinburgh in particular, in terms of what longer-term solutions might be. But the golden rule basically is you don't renew a lease without having a really serious conversation about, do you need to renew that lease, and where can those public bodies go. So on a regular basis we are not renewing leases, which is then enabling public bodies to co-locate elsewhere more effectively, and that's just an ongoing process. And that's got the advantage not just of saving costs, it makes it, in terms of the lease costs, also makes it easier for them to co-locate services in the back office, but it also makes it easier, and this is probably the biggest one to be honest, to be able to talk to each other more, to have a closer working relationship, which allows them to integrate services that are delivered to the public more effectively and to understand what each other are working on, and improve that cooperation and integration. So that is absolutely a key part of what we're doing. And on the examples that you cite, we're always looking for good examples of that, and that could be what you're talking about with SPCB bodies sharing. It could be with them co-locating with other public bodies that have got space, as many of them do, in their buildings, and we're also working increasingly closely with local government in that space, and of course health boards as well. So, and we've got examples of health boards now sharing premises with local authorities and all kinds of stuff. So all of that we're absolutely encouraging and creating the space and enabling that to happen, because I say it's got a whole plethora of benefits that beyond just the cost saving.
I mean, appreciate that it would be an upheaval if the SPC supported bodies were to move physical location. But if that were to be elsewhere in the public sector estate, that might save some money in it. I thought it was interesting last week that the Scottish Fiscal Commission clarified with us that they are located next to St Andrew's House in the Scottish Government estate, but again, seen as very, very independent. And I thought that was quite an example of how your location doesn't impact your independence. Is there anything else, Minister, that you wanted to emphasise to us that you haven't had a chance to say yet?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's been a great conversation, and a lot of things have been drawn out in it, which has been really helpful. I very much look forward to the conclusions and recommendations that you come to. I think that could be very helpful in the work that I'm taking forward. And as I said earlier, I know that the remit is fairly tightly drawn around about SPCB supported businesses, which from memory I think is an £18 million spend out of the government's total £60 billion spend. So you can get a size of the scale of this compared to the rest of the landscape. And I don't know what, far be it from me to direct the work of committees, but if there was work that looked more broadly at the wider public body landscape, that would be not unhelpful to support the work that government's taking forward in that space.
That's really helpful to have that collaborative approach underlined, Minister. I mean, just in that area, I appreciate the point you made in terms of the ratio comparatively. But, I mean, does the Scottish Government... So the Scottish Government is constantly, rightly, particularly at the moment, thinking about efficiency and value for money, given the wider fiscal environment and pressure. But does the Scottish Government take into account the capacity of the SPCB when proposing a new body, for example, the Victims and Witnesses Commissioner?
Well, I think, and this question came up at FPAC when I was in front of them previously on this subject. The way that process would work is that the Parliament, obviously as part of the budget process, will engage with government for a budget settlement for the Parliament. And I would have to believe that the Parliament would take into account what requirements it would have in order to be able to support those bodies as part of that process. So I think that is the mechanism whereby that would resolve itself. If you're talking about administrative support or whatever, clearly if it's committee time, that's a different resource that I've already commented on.
Clearly there has to be a consideration. The government's putting obligations and cost onto the SPCB, yes, by passing a bill that creates an SPCB funded commissioner. Yeah. So that's something we need to think about together going forward. Yeah,
as I say, but the budget process should deal with that, because that cost of that commissioner would be added onto the Parliament's budget that then gets put to government.
Mm-hmm. An engagement with the SPCB itself, the limited number of members that are part of that?
Well, again, I think that's up to Parliament to decide how it wants to configure. Sorry.
Although in the ministerial control framework, it's if a consideration of a new parliamentary commissioner is being considered, then one of the initial steps is to engage with the SPCB before taking it any further. So there is early engagement with the SPCB incorporated in the MCF.
Okay, thank you, Angus and Minister. That's helpful to get that clarity. Okay, members have any other questions?
That's step 6.
Members have any other questions? Okay, just to conclude, Minister, you kindly agreed to write to the committee as a follow-up to some of the points that Richard Leonard raised. Ash Regan and I will consider her to follow up on Ash Regan's questions just on things that have been said in the public domain in this committee and others. And we'll engage in correspondence on that. And all that's left is to thank you for your time and to your officials for being with us today. It's been very helpful for our evidence taking, and great to also receive that wider emphasis on the need for collaboration between Parliament and Government on all of this. So that concludes the public part of our meeting today, and as previously agreed by the committee, we now move into private session. Thank you.
Thank you.